Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. I heartily greet you to our first Simon Wiesenthal lecture in this year, 23, from the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce and to welcome here Kateřina Čapková, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague, and very busy, and so we are the more happy to have you here tonight, Kateřina. I've counted it, and during the last 3 years, you've done a record like editing one book a year, as far as I have seen it, and it reflects on what you are doing and what is your field of expertise. In 2020, there is a publication, Jewish and Romani Families and in the Holocaust and its Aftermath. These are co-edited volumes, 21 Prague and Beyond, Jews in the Bohemian lands, and 22 Jewish Lives under Communism, co-edited with Kamil Kijek. But to go into a little back in history, introduce you from your CV. That's that from 91 to 97. Kateřina Čapková studied history and German studies at Charles University in Prague, and she finished this with her PhD in Czech, and later it was published, I think, in English. Kateřina, is that right? And the English title is, it was published in 2005, and the English title of the later English translation was Czechs and Germans, Czechs, Germans, Jews, ? National Identity and the Jews of Bohemia. And this is a red thread through, as I see, through most of your academic career. And I've only picked out some of the, I think, important points that also connect on what you are presenting tonight. I think it's important to underline that in 2016, Kateřina established the Prague Forum for Romani Histories to research the history of Roma and Sinti. And you are part also of its advisory board, as far as I think. Yeah, is that right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So, but apart from that, and not the circle of your activities was not only centered on Prague, because Kateřina spent research years and stays at various foreign universities and institutions like the Westphalian Wilhelms University of Münster, the University of Vienna, of course, the University of Oxford, of Basel, of Berlin, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the University of Chicago. And maybe to put your work in a nutshell, I would say Kateřina researches the modern history of Jews in Europe, especially the history of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, and also the history of migration and escape movements of the Sinti and Roma. And maybe before I make it too long and take too much of your time, I welcome you again heartily. Thank you for coming, and we are looking forward to your lecture, which title is "You Ask Why I Was in a Labor Camp: Czechoslovak Jews and Roma Demand Recognition of the Wartime Suffering." Thank you, Kateřina. Welcome.
So many thanks for such a warm welcome, and many thanks to Eva Kovač for her invitation to the Simon Wiesenthal Institute's prestigious lecture series. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be able to speak here in Vienna about one part of the research project we have been working on at the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague. The project deals with the entanglement of the Jewish and Roma experience during and after the Second World War. It will result in publications by single authors and teams of authors, and also in the creation of databases. Given how little attention has been paid to the genocide of the Roma and Sinti, we are consciously prioritizing research on Romani history in the project. Geographically, it focuses on the territory that was called Czechoslovakia before the war and fell into various states during the war. Today it includes the Czech and Slovak republics, while what was once Subcarpathian Rus is now a part of Ukraine. We see this area as a laboratory because already before the Second World War there were very different Romani and Jewish communities in each area which differed demographically, linguistically, economically, socially, religiously. During the war, the communities also faced different legislation towards Jews and Roma in the various states under which they fell. So to some extent, then, it is true that the differences between the wartime experiences of Jews and Roma in the Protectorate, the Slovak state, and Hungary were so substantial that the difference in wartime experience was greater depending on where one was during the war than whether one was Jewish or Roma. In all parts of our project, we look for sources that convey the perspective of the Roma and Jews themselves. It is not easy to find such sources for Roma and Sinti. We are all the more grateful for a unique source that has been made accessible to researchers only a few years ago, and which I would like to introduce to you today. It comprises applications for the Certificate of Participation in the National Liberation Struggle. The title of the law from 1946 is Reparations Act for Members of the Czechoslovak Army Abroad and some participants in the struggle for liberation. In these applications, the applicants had to explain what happened to him or her during the war. Among the colleagues with whom we are working on this source, I would mention in particular Renata Berkiova and Michal Lončíková. Other colleagues help us with the development of the database, scanning, and adding selected data. I would emphasize from the outset that during the nearly 70 years the law was in force, it's really 70, from 1946 to 2015, this document was absolutely crucial for the recognition and eventual compensation of Jews and Roma in post-war Czechoslovakia. The law was initially intended for Czechoslovak soldiers who had fought in foreign allied armies, for partisans and for members of the home resistance. In the first post-war months and then years, it enabled the holder to acquire a certificate for the acquisition of real estate or a business formerly belonging to expelled German Czechoslovaks. From the end of the 1960s onward, it meant a significant addition to one's old age pension. In the 1990s, the law enabled the payment of lump sum compensation for widowed partners or for orphans who could prove that their relatives died because of resistance to Nazism or as victims of racial discrimination. Though the form of compensation and the amount changed over time, the group of persons who could apply for the certificate gradually expanded to include victims of racial persecution as well. And last but not least, under the 2001 decree, compensation was also available to people who had gone into hiding during the war. So far, our team has managed to collect more than 600 applications of Roma and Sinti, as well as several dozen of Jewish victims. which we can at the moment use as a contrasting sample. In the next phase of our research, my colleagues and I want to pay more attention to the applications submitted by Jewish survivors as well. About 450 applications from Roma and Sinti have been entered into a database, detailed database, and my analysis today is drawn mainly from this preliminary sample. As you can see from the map, we have a good sample of Roma applications from both the Czech Republic and Slovakia. There are admittedly more Slovak applications, and this disproportion will increase in the future due to the large demographic difference between the two countries. Before the war, there were between 9,000 to 10,000 Roma living in the Bohemian lands, compared to Slovakia and Subcarpathian Ruthenia, or Rus, where there were 10 times more Roma, roughly 100,000. Moreover, most of the Roma and Sinti from the Bohemian lands were murdered during the war. Consequently, few people were left to apply for a certificate after the war. In Slovakia, the Roma were also subjected to the genocidal policies of the Slovak and Hungarian states, but most of them survived the war, albeit often in poor health and impoverished. In my analysis of this unique source today, I wish to focus first on the systemic settings of the law, which harmed Jewish and Romani applicants equally. In the second part, I will focus on the differences between the options available to Jewish and Romani applicants. So I would first address some of the discriminatory aspects of the Compensation Act from 1946 and its application, which affected both Roma and Jewish applicants, and I have further divided this point into three subtopics. From the beginning, the law was intended primarily for soldiers in Allied armies, partisans, and also for so-called political prisoners. Sorry. Okay. The Jewish and Romani applicants included a large number of soldiers and partisans. Their proportion in relation to the size of the pre-war Romani and Jewish communities was definitely greater than the proportion of Allied soldiers and partisans within the non-Jewish and non-Roma society. Concerning the partisans, their number as a proportion of the population differs greatly in the Bohemian lands from what it was in Slovakia. The largest proportion participated in the fighting in the Slovak uprising in 1944. The map would look similar regarding Jewish applicants, we assume, if we also had data for them. Most of the Jewish and Romani survivors, however, went through labor or concentration camps during the war or survived in hiding. In the first decades after the war, the state and the anti-fascist organizations considered having suffered racial discrimination to have been a less serious grievance than having suffered as a political prisoner, on the grounds that allegedly racial discrimination was passive resistance and resulting in suffering only from having belonged to a particular ethnic group. In the struggle for recognition of the suffering caused by the wartime racist policies, the Jews and the Roma were therefore equally at disadvantage. Peter Halama analyzes this in the context of the Jewish Holocaust in his important book, Nationale Helden und jüdische Opfer from 2015. The Jews and Roma who survived in hiding during the war have only been recognized since 2001. Here too, this war experience is more typical of Slovakia than of the Bohemian lands. And again, this applies not only to Roma, but also to Jews, where especially in the last year of the war, dozens of Jewish families were saved from deportation to Auschwitz because they were in hiding. In 2001, however, only a fraction of those who had been hidden were still alive. A large number of them had been small children during the war and had only had information about being in hiding indirectly from their parents. This is attested, for example, by the testimony of a Slovak Romani woman who was 4 years old during the war and who, based on what her father had told her, describes her family's wartime experiences in great detail. But as to the location of the shelter, which the officials required for the certificate, she was not sure about the name of the village. She was not issued a certificate. Albina Balázsová, who was 14 years old at the end of the war, again described in her application in vivid detail how the friend of her sister had been raped by German soldiers, how her uncle had been burned to death with other people in a wooden hut, and how she and her mother had only managed to save themselves by hiding in the woods. But she too was unable, 60 years later, to pinpoint where it all happened, because she left Slovakia for Bohemia soon after the war, and she did not obtain a certificate. Another reason why many of the people in hiding did not obtain a certificate was that the officials required further testimony to that of the Romani applicant. This also contradicted the logic of the circumstances in which fugitives tried to conceal themselves from most people in the surrounding villages. The files with the applications of the Romani victims also contain correspondence between Prague officials and the then current mayors of the Slovak villages. The Prague officials asked the Slovak mayors whether it would be possible to obtain evidence of the hiding of the Roma among the inhabitants of the village. The Romani applicants thus became dependent on the testimony of non-Romani Slovaks, whose parents may well have driven them out of the village during the war. And to illustrate the absurd assessment of the application even more, I will also mention the case of Elemir Farkas. In his application, he argued that his family's hiding place in an abandoned house in the forest was known to the entire East Slovak village, and that finding witnesses would therefore be easy. But his application was not granted for that very reason. The argument was that if everyone in the village knew about his hiding place, I quote, "It was not a case of hiding, but of residing in the forest, even if under difficult circumstances." The outcome of applications for compensation for Roma in hiding was dismal. Only a small portion of applicants received certificates. We have not yet worked out this aspect for Jewish applicants, but it is safe to assume that they face the same difficulties. Another ideological aspect of the law was its inherently nationalistic view of the world, and especially after the communist takeover in early 1948, its emphasis on loyalty to the party. The law was written only a year after the war, while the expulsion of the Germans of Czechoslovakia was underway, and the Czechoslovak government was trying to gain international support for the expulsion of Magyars of Slovakia. Already in 1945, people of Hungarian or Jewish nationality have been deprived, that's the word, of Czechoslovak citizenship, and the process of regaining it for people who were themselves victims of the Nazi regime often took up to 2 years. Czechoslovak and since 1993 Czech citizenship was one of the conditions for obtaining a certificate. So it is therefore important to remember that many Czechoslovak Jews and Roma could not apply for a certificate at all after the war. The nationalist filter then discriminated especially against Jews and Roma who had been in eastern and southern Slovakia during the war. It was here, in fact, that the Jewish and Romani communities had been the largest before the Second World War. And all these territories had been annexed to Hungary. Hungary, as Laszlo Church, also a member of our team, would tell us more about, assigned both the Roma and the Jews to special battalions of the Hungarian army, where they were often put into slave labor. But especially in the first post-war years, applications from people who had been members of the Hungarian army during the war were refused. Géza Winter, a Jew, had been sent to the forced labor in the Hungarian army during the war and was then sent to Mauthausen concentration camp. When he applied for a certificate in 1949, he was turned down in 1950 on the grounds that he had served in an enemy army. He then tried again in 1969, and this time received a certificate, although only for having been in Mauthausen. What is striking about the applications of the Slovak and Subcarpathian Jews who decided to settle in the Bohemian lands after the war is that in their case, like in the case of the Roma, local administration was required to submit a report on their current behavior and whether they were leading an orderly life. So prejudice against Ostjuden seems then, next to the anti-Roma prejudice, to have been a constant among Prague officials throughout the 20th century. The third systemic setting that discriminated against both Jews and Roma from Slovakia is related to the topic of the production of knowledge, to which Ari Joskovits devotes so much attention in his superb book, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews and the Holocaust from this year. The easiest way for an applicant to have his or her internment in a concentration or other camp confirmed was to write a letter to Bad Arolsen, where the archives of the International Tracing Service are kept. This archive was created primarily by means of collecting lists and card files from various Nazi camps liberated by the Allies. Thus, the Roma and Jews of the Protectorate, whose internment in the Nazi camps was mostly documented, had a distinct advantage. Much worse off were Jews and Roma who had lived through the war in the Slovak state or in Hungary, where it was much harder to obtain a confirmation of internment in camps, whose lists of prisoners, if the lists survived at all, were often untraceable. Even in the Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia, it was long unknown where the archival records related to the so-called gypsy camp in Lety in South Bohemia were kept. As my colleague Renata Berkiova has discovered, certificates of internment in Lety from the archives in Třeboň only appear in certificate applications from 1970 onward. Thus, a hierarchy of camps was created after the war, in which similarly horrific conditions prevailed, but in the eyes of the officials, the camps run by the Nazis had a higher standing than the lesser known and less well documented camps set by local allies of the Nazis. Moreover, in the case of the lesser known camps, there was always, in contrast to the Nazi camps, the follow-up question, why was the applicant interned there, in order to exclude criminal reasons. So here I come back to the title of my talk, which is taken from the letter of Stefan Olach from Slovakia. So far I have spoken about systemic measures that discriminated against victims of racial persecution, regardless of whether they were Jews or Roma. So now I would like to focus on their different situation or status. The main difference, which Eliana Ader and I also pointed out in the volume we edited, Jewish and Romani Families in the Holocaust and its Aftermath. So the main difference between the situation of the Roma and of the Jews was that the Roma, unlike the Jews, had no umbrella organization of their own. This proved to be a key handicap for the Roma not only during the war, but also after it. Jewish organizations, especially Jewish communities, helped Jewish survivors to obtain the necessary documentation, and they also testified on their members about their wartime experience. In the Romani context, it was therefore highly important that at least the Gypsy Roma Association was founded in 1969, which, among other things, was also dedicated to Holocaust commemoration and to the recognition of the genocide of Roma and Sinti. As part of our project, the prehistory of the Gypsy Roma Association is being researched by my colleague Helena Sadilkova, who is preparing a book on the topic with two other colleagues. The work of the Gypsy Roma Association on behalf of the Romani applicants is evidenced by their letters of support, which bear the organization's beautiful logo. So letters of support and applications from the late 1960s and very early 1970s. Already in 1973, however, the organization was dissolved by the communist regime. So it was only 69 to 73. That the Gypsy Roma Association had a positive effect on obtaining certificates is also evident from our graph, showing successful applications for certificates over time. The increase in applications at the end of the 1960s is, however, also related to an amendment of the 1946 law from 1968, which allowed certificate holders to receive a higher pension. If you look at the list of the most frequent documents, among which the officials have marked those that concern the applicant, there is already a pre-printed option for Jewish applicants to contact the Council of Jewish Communities. Because of the non-existence of an umbrella Romani organization for most of the period, Roma had to arrange their own documentation from the state archives and also from Bad Arolsen. After the collapse of the communist regime in late 1989, the surviving Jewish former prisoners of Theresienstadt in Czech Terezín decided to establish the Terezín Initiative Foundation. With financial support of the German government, Miroslav Kárný then succeeded in founding the Terezín Initiative Institute, still existing, which became the main center for research on the Holocaust of Jews. Thanks to this position, Miroslav Kárný, himself a survivor of Auschwitz and Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, became a member of the advisory commission that issued the certificate. So here we encounter the theme of hierarchy of victims and Jewish paternalism, which Ari Joskovits has analyzed so well, another topic important for Ari in his recent book. A Jewish survivor had an important say in the assessment of Romani applications. Although the Museum of Romani Culture in Brno was also established after the collapse of the communist regime, no Roma representative was invited to sit on the committee. As early as the mid-1990s, the commission, including Kárný, considered applications from widowed partners or orphans of former prisoners who could now apply for one-off financial compensation for the death of their loved ones during the war. In deciding on some of the Romani applications, the Commission, in my opinion, then failed morally. And this brings us to the key point of my talk, namely the criminalization of the Romani Holocaust victims. Now, in order to explain this central theme of research on the Holocaust of the Roma and Sinti, I must go a bit further back in time. Until the beginning of 1942, the protectorate policy towards the Roma and Sinti did not in principle differ from the policy between the wars. In May 1939, just a couple of months after the German invasion, the police headquarters in Prague asked the Protectorate Ministry of the Interior whether new legislation would be expected regarding the Gypsies. The ministry officials replied that new legislation would be unnecessary. According to the ministry, the Traveling Gypsies Act from 1927 was so loosely worded that it could only be applied by supplementary interpretation. So, what was the point of the 1927 Act? Sorry for this, but it's necessary. In writing this law, the interwar Czechoslovak legislators were strongly inspired by a similar law in Bavaria. In the first article of the law, the traveling gypsies were defined as, I quote, gypsies traveling from place to place and other vagabonds who were work-shy, who shared the gypsy way of life, even if in either case they have permanent residence for part of the years, especially in winter. That's the definition. This law significantly influenced the futures of the Roma, Sinti, and many other people who were considered gypsy because of changing their place of residence frequently. It had an impact on them for most of the interwar period, during the war, and surprisingly in the post-war years as well, because this law was in force until 1950. The 1927 law had several purposes. One of them was to register such people and to ensure better supervision and control over their number and movement. In order to catch the gypsies, the gendarmes had to collect the anthropometric data and fingerprints of these people, to take note of all their scars, tattoos, and birthmarks, and to issue them what was called a gypsy identity card. All people above 14 years had to carry this ID card all the time. The law limited sorry, this is. Oh, I don't know what's happening. Oh, it's back. Okay. No, not yet. Okay. The law limited the number of Romani and also non-Romani families who were included into the definition of the gypsy who could travel together to only a nuclear family, so not larger families could travel together. It also allowed some villages and towns to ban gypsies from entering. The authorities then had to indicate this with a sign at the entrance of the village, to the village or town. And especially in the end of the 1930s, the number of such villages and towns was increasing. In addition, the same law made it possible to take away traveling gypsies' children under age of 18 and put them in the care either of non-Romani families or educational institutions. Romani families could not appeal against such a decision. The 1927 Act was signed first by President Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. This is no, it's right. The general image of this politician who has been celebrated among Jews as their defender against anti-Semitism and as an enlightened and wise president is therefore markedly different from the Jewish context among the Roma in the Bohemian lands to this day. The 1927 law on traveling gypsies, which was enforced throughout Czechoslovakia, placed Roma and other people of no fixed address in the position of second-class citizens. Deciding who would be required to carry the gypsy identity card ultimately fell to the decision of local gendarmes, who had since the 19th century been trained to report on the number of local gypsies. They sent detailed information to the registry with the fingerprints of everyone they considered to be gypsies, often regardless of whether those people lived at one address or changed their place of residence. So here, for example, we see the gypsy ID card of Irina Heráková. And it's clear from these pictures alone that the authorities regarded the Roma, Sinti, and others who were allegedly gypsies as potential criminals. The ID card did not even include a photograph to show that its bearer was human. We have a photograph of Jiřina Heráková, however, because she was trying to obtain a regular ID card in 1941. Her application was refused, and in March 1943 she was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Given the extent to which the Roma and Sinti have been criminalized, it is hardly surprising that some of them had criminal records, for instance, for having violated the 1927 law. For example, by not observing the ban on entering a village, or for traveling in a group larger than a close-knit family, for taking part in a fight, regardless of who started it or whether it was a matter of self-defense. The alleged theft of a chicken was also quite frequently recorded without proof of the theft. For centuries, the state pushed the Roma to the margins of society, where they often found themselves unwittingly on the edge of the law. Most Roma and Sinti did not perceive the German occupation of the Bohemian lands, which began in mid-March 1939, as a turning point. All regulations derived from the 1927 law remained in force. Nevertheless, the pressure to settle Roma and Sinti increased significantly, but this was prevented by many individual municipalities that were unwilling to offer the Roma the right of domicile, like Heimatsrecht. The government decree on the preventive suppression of crime, issued on 9th March 1942, which copied a similar decree in the Reich, made it possible to place people in preventive custody without the justification, merely on suspicion of being allegedly antisocial. Among the persons suspected of criminal behavior, the Gypsies were explicitly mentioned in the law. People who were arrested for breaking this law were sent not only to the camps in Hodonín in Moravia and Lety in South Bohemia. Other places frequently used for their detention were the prisons in Ruzyně district of Prague, in Pardubice and Brno. Some of the prisoners were sentenced to death as so-called Volksschädlinge. From April 1942, police headquarters in Prague and Moravia also began to send entire transports of alleged anti-socials to Auschwitz I, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and other Nazi camps. The proportion of Roma among the people in these transports, which were sent irregularly from April 42 to late 44, was small. Still, as Ctibor Nečas estimates, in Moravia only, at least 200 Roma were deported on these trains. In analyzing the applications of Roma, I focused on those from the mid-1990s, in which the Roma asked for compensation because their loved ones, whether a partner or a parent, had died during the war as the result of racial discrimination. The analysis shows that for those who were sentenced to death by Nazi courts as Volksschädlinge, claims for compensation were not granted. In 1995, for example, the daughter of Anna Švehlová submitted a claim for compensation for the death of her mother. Anna Švehlová was arrested in July 1942, for alleged criminal activity in Pankrácz prison, Prague. She was tried in Dresden and returned to Pankrácz, where she was put to death in June 1943. In her absence, Švehlová's 3 children, aged 8 to 10, were interned in the gypsy camp in Lety. In May 1943, they were released from the camp, as it was decided that they were not gypsies after all. One of the daughters, who was 8 years old at the time of her mother's arrest, received a letter from the Commission of the Inquiry in 1996, which reads, I quote, I am very sorry, but the reasons for your mother's for your mother's arrest and imprisonment was for criminal activity, not for activity as defined in this law. It was therefore not political, national, racial, or religious persecution. And it continues, your case has to be discussed, has also been discussed by my advisory commission, consisting of representatives of independent associations and institutions, and there is a list of them, including Theresian Initiative Foundation, the Christian Academy, Historical Institute of the Army of the Czech Republic. They have taken a negative position on your request. Another example is that of Anna Serinkova. She was born in Pankrácz prison in 1943 because her mother was arrested while she was pregnant and was then put to death shortly after Anna was born. Thanks to the bravery of her cellmates, she was smuggled out of the prison in a laundry hamper and into the Social Institute of the city of Prague, where she lived to see the end of the war. Her father was also put to death during the war. Anna's request for compensation for the death of her parents was also refused. The reason, I quote, regarding your parents, I must state that they were involved in crime, theft, which means they are not entitled to the document. I know that your parents were convicted under the cruel laws of the war and that their deaths have caused you a painful and irreparable loss, which has strongly marked your fate. She never saw her parents. But I ask you to understand that I am obliged to respect the above quoted provisions of the relevant law and that I cannot do otherwise in your case. The requests of the descendants of Roma who died in concentration camps, even if they had been deported there as alleged anti-socials, were granted. So, obviously, the members of the Commission considered the letter of the law more important than the moral values that the law was supposed to help uphold. Knowingly or not, the Commission reproduced a criminalizing narrative about the Roma, replicated the language and judgment from the Nazi period, and once again humiliated and shamed the survivors who hoped that in freedom after the end of the communist regime, they would finally see justice and the recognition of their families' suffering. So in conclusion, I would state that the analysis of this unique source reminds us that not only the suffering of the Roma, but also the suffering of the Jews during the Second World War was downplayed for decades. The journey for the recognition of the Holocaust of the Jews was also long and painful for many survivors. This should not be forgotten today, when it often seems that recognition of the wartime suffering of the Jews was a matter of course. It was not. But if I were to point to, from my point of view, one major difference between the recognition of the genocide of the Jews and of the Roma, it would be this. The Roma and some other people who were labeled as gypsies were not only victims of racial thinking or racist thinking, just like the Jews, but their genocide was also associated with moral shame, which they are still subjected to in many countries around the world today. I therefore consider it a great task for us historians, not only to take an interest in Romani history and not to leave it on the sidelines as has been the case until recently, but also to prevent the adoption of the terminology and perspective of the perpetrators. The Roma must not expect further disappointment and disgrace from us. If we do not live up to this task, we too will be held to blame for the outrageous treatment that the Roma and Sinti have faced at every turn in many centuries, past and present, such as is the case in the Czech and Slovak republics. So thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Kateřina, and maybe have a comfortable seat now with me here on the table. And before I open the round to the public, I would like to ask you one or two questions, and then we would integrate our audience with this. I think it was a very fascinating talk, and I have to admit that most of it that you told us was new to me, and not only surprising, but in a way also shocking. And I would like to ask you. I mean, you have stated your talk was very much about those continuities over time if it comes to discrimination and criminalization. And I would like to ask you. You have stated those facts. You work with those applications, with the data that you have gathered, and you have organized in a database, and you come up with really highly interesting results. What do we do with them? We have if we take, for example, the law of 1927, it's almost 100 years now that it has been passed, yeah, and so we have the Czechoslovak Republic, we have the war, the protectorate, we have the communist regime, and then we have the Czech state and the Slovak state, and still you see those continuities. How do you explain that?
So I think one part of the answer is that there are definitely also continuities in the Jewish case. I really don't want to downplay the relevance of fight against anti-Semitism. It's really, I do not prefer one victim group over another one. What I find fascinating when studying the history of Roma and Sinti is that, as you already suggested, it totally destroys our periodization. And that's really fascinating. And it also, we see, for me, for example, when I first encountered this very different image of Masaryk, and exactly as you mentioned, this continuity from the interwar into communist regime. I think it raises so many important questions that we probably would never be, like maybe we would be afraid to raise them, but it's especially this in the history of Roma and Sinti I see, and this is also well described also by Celia Donnert in her book about Roma in Czechoslovakia. that there is this tension between restriction and like social engineering. And it's always, and if there is a dictatorship, whether communist or Nazi, there is always more centralized discrimination and social engineering. This is another chapter because I actually want to speak about it at Yale, so I know that some of you will be there next month. This is another topic, but I discovered that at the beginning of the Second World War, up to really middle of 1942, there was a parallel policy towards Roma. On one hand, this very discriminatory and sending them to labor camps and so on. At the same time, a pressure on the municipalities to accept Roma. And they really force, or they really put pressure also on schools to accept Roma. So it's really, it's again, especially when you have this parallel stories of Jews and Roma at the same time when Jews cannot enter a school, Roma are for the first, in some cases for the first time, actually invited to attend school education. And then they are taken, because there is a change of this legislation in the middle of the war. Then they are taken to the camp and to Auschwitz. But it's really this. Sorry, I know I'm long, but it's this very strange balancing between this like very restrictive and during the war genocidal policy, and at the same time this pressure of forced assimilation. And so the question: are these two sides of the same coin?
Yeah. And my first thought was, but this is of course, if you look at the long durée of almost 100 years, that is not very convincing that it would be maybe rewarding also in looking into continuities, and if it comes to the personal, that is writing the text of the laws or that is implementing those laws. I remember when we had at the Jena University we had a student working on recompensation of Jewish property when there was Aryanization during the Third Reich, and then what happened in the GDR, left in Eastern Germany afterwards, and he found out that the same persons that had been responsible for the Aryanization in the Third Reich were later responsible for the recompensation, yeah, because they were still sitting in those offices, they had those files, and then now they were serving a different regime, and still were the same people, no? But on the other hand, I have to cut myself now with this line because there's nobody sitting in an office for 100 years. So, but still, I would think it would be still good to look into the continuity of elites and of bureaucracy to see how this also affects the way it is dealt with. But obviously, this is not the answer. But because the thing seems to be much bigger, just bigger than it could be explained with just sitting the same people sitting in the same offices. No? What happened? I would like to ask you in 69, between 69 and 73, in these 4 years that they had this the Gypsy Roma Association.
Mm-hmm.
Have you some information why it was possible to create it and why it has been liquidated 4 years afterwards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's again a strange periodization, right? It's a late outcome of spring 1968. It was planned to be earlier, but they managed 1969, and with the normalization, they had to close again. The major point of conflict was that this organization, which not only was focused on the remembrance of Holocaust, but also tried to arrange for cooperatives of Roma, and also it had a very significant cultural significance because they were publishing a journal. Part of it was in Romanes, part of it in Czech. And they had a commission for like standardizing the Romani language, because as you probably know there are many dialects, and it was a standardization. It reminds me a little bit on Yivo and this standardization of a language actually in the time of when the language is in danger, which is quite different from the story of other standardization of languages, which were mostly connected with the creation of a state and so on. So this was a very important organization. Unfortunately, existed only for 4 years, but the fruits of this were lasting, and people, of course, did not become passive. And the same people who were the founders of this Gypsy Roma Association were also founders of the Museum of Romani Culture in Brno, and it's really actually unique also in Europe or worldwide that we have a museum founded by Roma themselves, and which is also now supported by the state.
And when was that founded, that museum, which you know?
So I should know exactly, but it was 91 or 92. Mm. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I would now open the floor for questions from the audience. Emil? And Miriam, you feel free to ask yourself also if you are holding the mic here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I was just curious if you could tell a little bit more about kind of ordinary people, civilians, the extent of their involvement in the persecution of Roma, and also when it comes to the interwar period, kind of perception of Roma. Yesterday we had a presentation with colleague Gergely Kund in the Romano Center here, and he found in different diaries that the perception of Roma was often less hostile than when it comes to the Jewish. But what I get here is a very negative impression overall among the non-Roma population. But and also, sorry, just the last thing, but also is this kind of this project social engineering and stuff, is that solely an interwar phenomenon that begins, or are there also continuities to the late Habsburg Empire? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Definitely there is a lot of continuation from at least middle of the 19th century. And there is now Vita Zalar from Slovenia is now writing a doctoral thesis about the Habsburg legislation towards Roma, and it's a fascinating work. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And as for the relationship between non-Roma and Roma, it's always much more complex and interesting if you go into the local archives. And I'm now more focused on the war, though I also have some research on the interwar, and it's always about the people. So for example, I found request or a letter written by a guy to the city council in Písek that Roma, he spoke of them as gypsies, were camping on close to his place, and that he could not go he could not use the journey with his because he was he needed it to go to the field, and so the city council asked the mayor from the village, because it was from a small village, and the mayor from the village wrote back, but this is a total misunderstanding. We know those gypsies, and they are coming regularly. They are very nice. If it would only need this guy to ask them to push the wagon back, or so it's really nice to find such documents in archives where you see it's about perception, about communication, and you actually see that also this regularity, which was very often the case, that it is confirmed also by some of the survivors. We are now preparing a book of memories of Jacinto, and whose family was changing the place during the interwar period, and he also confirmed that it was always mostly the same route, because they knew already the people there. The people were actually expecting them to come, because many of them had some, they were sharpening knives or something like this, and so they knew exactly where they will camp, and they also made. Sometimes they met other people from their family. So it's really on the bottom level. It's so much more about basic relationships, and this is also why I love this bottom up perspective. It's only in this source, as I've mentioned. Of course, I had to analyze this centralized policy, which is sometimes much harsher than what is going on locally. But for us, this source is totally unique, that you have the testimonies of the Roma, their voice. This is totally unique.
Thank you so much, Katka, for sharing these brand new research results with us. So it was really moving. I have two questions. The first one is the contextualization of this 27 law. As I remember correctly, it was the time in the new Czechoslovakia to re-establish the concept of residence, the concept of citizenship, the concept of being there legally. I wonder whether we could put this law, this very special law against the traveling gypsy, within this context. Because as I remember, even the Hungarians in Slovakia wouldn't be able to get citizenship till 28. So can we pair this concept of the Czechoslovak state with other minorities as well? This is the first question. The second question, I wonder whether you have some source or some traces about how these Roma families or Roma persons just knew about the possibility to apply. Was it published in the journal, in the newspapers? It was gossips or some hidden networks. So do you have any traces about the? Because usually it's not easy to get the information that I can apply for a compensation, and the number is amazing, and also the territorial differentiation of the applications. So I wonder how these media worked at that time. Do you have any information about it? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. So two very different questions. The first one about interwar. For me it was also surprising that it came at the time when the republic was consolidated and economy was okay. So it's really striking, and it's at the same time there was a huge pressure to have such a law from the very beginning of the Czechoslovak Republic. And even if it's hard for us to have this perspective, but when I was researching the discussions around it, there were people, fortunately, who were totally against it, and these were social democrats and communists in the parliament. But otherwise, there were also people who thought that it's too mild, and I have read the discussions in the of the police, and they were collecting opinion of the gendarmes, and gendarmes. Some of the gendarmes were really like furious, even that this law actually permitted traveling. That the pressure was to totally like ban this way of living, and those ID cards actually enabled those families to travel. But I think I should mention that there was also a reaction of the Roma and Sinti themselves, who, and this is exactly what you mentioned, that actually many of them already had citizenship, full citizenship, could vote and everything, and for them it was backlash, and so we have quite some applications for like where they criticize the fact that they are counted as gypsies. It's also this discussion is great for understanding that the term gypsy is really not the same as Roma and Sinti. The Roma and Sinti do not understand gypsiness as something even loosely connected with their identity. This is a label of the police, which has to do with this criminal tone and work shy and so on, and this is not what they are. And so they explain it's very they are not gypsy, and it's not that they would not be proud Roma. They are proud Roma, but gypsiness is just something else. So this is unfortunately these discussions show that even though the law could be understood as a definition based on way of life, it was not, because in the explanations why this or that applicant cannot get a regular ID card, it was argued with the number of with the color of skin, or with that the person is relative to somebody who is a gypsy. So it's really the racist thinking is there, obviously. As for the post-war, that's really a very interesting question. I assume that it was definitely a snowball method, and it also helps us to understand that Roma and Sinti were definitely not a homogeneous group, and that also their wartime experience was very different. So we have many partisans or soldiers who especially fought with the Red Army or the so-called Svoboda Army, and they were informed like the other soldiers or partisans. So this is another channel. Then we know from the chronology of the applications from the Bohemian lands that because Brno was the center of the the cultural and political activities of Roma, as we see with the Gypsy Roma Association, which started in Brno again, and with the museum, so that the applications of Moravian Roma came first. Yeah, so you see the chronology. So it's really the snowball, and in the 1990s, it's a different story. The state really tried to reach them, and there were several NGOs who were explicitly informing them, and some of them tried to help them to apply.
I do have also a question and a comment. Thanks, first of all, for this really amazing presentation. I have to say, almost shocked, especially by what you presented of the analysis of the applications, because it resembles so much what happened here in Austria with Roma who survived, and probably many other countries like Germany. I mean, it's also interesting, you mentioned the law in 1926, 27. Same here in Austria. By 1938, we had a gypsy registry with 8,000 Burgenland Roma, which then helped the Nazi persecution and the extermination of Roma in Austria. And after the war, what I found so interesting, when we have the compensation claims, it's the same tone, that Roma kind of are not recognized because they were criminalized. And I think it's really, I mean, you can read one by one. What I found very interesting in your presentation is, like in Austria, we had this in the 60s, and in the Czech Republic in the 90s, which for me is really amazing to see, because after at least 1989 in Austria, there was a kind of rethinking. Maybe this is a wrong narrative and we have to change it. But still, in the Czech Republic, it was applied. Though, what is also interesting, because you said in regimes or communist regimes, we were a democratic republic, and it happened here. And I found it very interesting, and I was wondering whether you have a kind of exchange, because I think it's very systemic across Europe. There are so many similarities. They are so similar that it's not happening only there or here. It's something much broader, I believe. And I was particularly wondering, why still in the 90s in the Czech Republic you could apply this narrative, and also whether you see a link to the non-recognition of the Roma camp in Lety, where we had the pig farm until very recently. And the last question is to social engineering. I mean, in the Czech Republic there was sterilization of Roma women. To what extent do you see there's a connotation, with policy?
Thank you so much. So thank you also for all the comments and comparisons. This is definitely true, and in our this research project is focused on Czechoslovakia, but we already have there several states. And but in the activities of the Prague Forum for Romani Histories, we try to be always European-wide or even transatlantic. So if I may pick up the last topic you mentioned as the start, you mentioned the forced sterilization of Romani women. Our Prague Forum organized a workshop about this topic, and it was exactly as you say, fascinating to see that it was parallel, especially in Switzerland, in Sweden, and Czechoslovakia, but we were also other cases. What was a little bit, if I may be a little bit personal, and it's a theory only, or but it's really very interesting that most of the countries which were involved and really in forced sterilization of Romani women had some either non-religious or Protestant background. So I think this is also, and here I would see a link to Masaryk as well, that this is when I try to understand him, how he could be so cruel to Roma and so open to Jews. There is really to discipline and like to have an order, and it's very disturbing. Otherwise, definitely there is. This is also a topic which we would like to do in the future, to show. Another topic is also taking Romani children out of the families, and it's really trans-European. And I think it would be great if we could have an international project about it, maybe with your institute. Yeah.
We have a few minutes left, so there's still occasion for the one or other question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. Also related to this 1927 law and Masaryk, did eugenics play any role in Czechoslovakia? In Romania, which case I know about, there were public health schools in the main university centers that tried to transform racism in some sort of a scientific support, and this support was somehow used during the Holocaust, especially for the Roma and Jews.
Thank you very much. I'm not expert on this. I should be open about it because, as you probably have seen, I'm really interested in the bottom-up perspective, in the individual stories. But I know from others' work that Prague was actually one of the centers of eugenic and research, and during the war Prague played also important role in the Nazi context, that there was an institute of eugenics, so it was definitely there. This
Thank you so much for the terrific presentation. I wanted to ask if you could tell something more about the interactions or relations between Jews and Roma during the war, but also in the post-war period. Have there been some links or dimension of support and help, or was it more about this hierarchy of victimhood? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's hard to get such question at the end because it's a huge one, and it is a very important one for our project, and this is why like the flagship of our research of our project should be a volume where we are 7, right, Laci? So Laci is one of the co-authors. We have 3 sub-teams, each for the Bohemian lands, Slovakia, and the Hungarian parts of pre-war Czechoslovakia, and we try to see the entanglement and parallels, but also we can also show that there was sometimes no entanglement. Yeah? So it's not that we would like to somehow paint it in this or that way. We actually really want to analyze it as it is, and we see quite a different picture in each of the region. So there is much less contact between Roma and Jews in the Bohemian lands. For the wartime, we see them together, especially in Auschwitz, where there is a family camp of the protectorate Jews and a so-called gypsy camp, very close to each other. So in the testimonies, we have so many reports on each others. So this is unique. And what is true for all the territory, Nazi or Slovak or Hungarian administration often put Jewish doctors into camps with Roma. So there is also a very interesting common denominator. But there is so much more in Eastern Slovakia, especially, where which is exactly as I've mentioned, the territory with most Jews and Roma in all Czechoslovakia before the war. They lived there from the Jewish perspective, I would say shtetls, but from the Romani case, from Romani perspective, it's a small village or small town, where interestingly Roma often play the contact person for the Jews. So they are Shabbos Goyim. They are working on the fields of the Jews, and as the collection of testimonies collected by Melena Hipšmanová shows, there are many very nice recollections of the Roma that, for example, the Jews really paid them in contrast to others who only gave them a bread. And so it's there is really on a daily basis a relationship. So this is really different in different parts. Maybe Latsi could say more about Subcarpathian Rus, but we are probably at the end. So.
If you want to add something, please go ahead. I can. Yeah, we have. For sure.
So, but according to our research, of course, apart from peaceful coexistence, we also have proof of conflicts. And as the entire Hungarian society at the time, of course, as all societies in Central Europe, was deeply permeated by anti-Semitic sentiments. The Roma were also not exception because they were part of the society, and which is also striking that in contemporary Jewish writings, diaries, testimonies, we also find pretty hard anti-Roma sentiments sometimes. For example, we have a very great example from one of the Hungarian Jewish writers of the period, a very famous Holocaust diary or documentary novel, which has very harsh racist commentaries about the Roma. And it's really hard to believe because the person was like a liberal journalist and, of course, a Jew who was persecuted. So it's also, there is a kind of a dark side of this relationship, obviously, and also which will be very interesting, and we will try to demonstrate it in the volume that anti-Roma and anti-Jewish policies seem to be, at least in the case of Hungary, very far from each other, and there are big differences. For example, if we give the example of labor service and military service, it's interesting to note that unlike the Jews, the Hungarian Roma were overwhelmingly serving in the Hungarian army, and this way, paradoxically, they were really in like a perpetrator army, an Axis army, and I think it was one of the most striking parts of this, the story of these applications, that they were refused because they served in an Axis army, even Jewish labor servicemen. And here we have a question, actually, that what was the issue with the Slovak army, which was also an Axis army, and Jews and Roma were serving in the Slovak army. So how did they respond to that? It's a question. But making the long story short, by the end of the war, however, the history and the history of persecution of Roma and Jews in Hungary became very closely and strikingly intertwined. And actually in this period of the war, like in the very last months of the war, their stories became pretty much parallel and share the same experiences.
Yeah, I only may add that this is actually Laci's topic, that he is for us also analyzing this massacres at the end of the war where Jews and Roma were killed together. So this is the tragic end of the story.
Yeah, so thank you very much also for your addition to this, which only shows us that you are really, I think, here conducting a highly interesting project with many open questions still, and to put all this into perspective, also with the gray shades or the dark sides of it, is, I think, is a challenge, and we wish you luck with it. And thank you very much that you came tonight and presented your fascinating talk to all of us. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.